Well, this is going to be another long video, and it's going to be on conditions that are over and underdiagnosed in disability patients. And as is often the case, I got the idea for this video from a commenter on my channel who was somewhat critical of me. I had stated that often I see people with bipolar illness who are misdiagnosed, and the commenter said that sometimes bipolar illness, which should be known by its old name, manic depression, is misdiagnosed as depression due to no mistake of the diagnoser, and that's absolutely true. To make the diagnosis of manic depression, the person has to have episodes of mania alternating with normal periods, alternating with periods of depression. I know of a patient who had their first serious episode of depression with serious thoughts of self-harm at age 10. But they didn't have any episodes of mania until they were 14 years old. Therefore, for 4 years, the correct diagnosis, manic depression or bipolar illness, could not be made by anyone. And that brings up the subject of misdiagnosis. Misdiagnosis is when a doctor makes the wrong diagnosis. And people tend to think that that's always because the doctor is incompetent or it's malpractice. And while occasionally that is the case, often it's because the disease is simply impossible to diagnose when the doctor sees it. And the doctor who saw that person when they were 10 and had the serious depression couldn't make the diagnosis of manic depression because they hadn't had any episodes of mania. That's very different from overdiagnosis and underdiagnosis. In overdiagnosis, the doctor makes the diagnosis of a condition that the doctor knows the person doesn't really have. In underdiagnosis, the doctor doesn't make the diagnosis of a condition that they know that a person really does have. And if you find this sort of thing interesting, you might want to subscribe to my channel. I generally put out one disability-related video every Friday. Now, people must be wondering, why the heck would doctors deliberately make the wrong diagnosis or not make the correct diagnosis? Well, there are all sorts of reasons. First of all, most people don't know that there are fads and fashions of medical diagnosis. Just like sometimes it's fashionable to wear bell-bottom pants and sometimes it's very unfashionable. The second is people-pleasing, and specifically patient-pleasing. Certain patients really want certain diagnoses and will get very upset if the doctor doesn't go along. And certain people really don't want the correct diagnosis and will get extremely upset if the doctor doesn't go along. As an example, I correctly diagnosed many people in the emergency department with prescription drug addiction, but when I would inform them of their correct diagnosis, I would get everything from threats of having me fired to suing me to even killing me. They really didn't want their correct diagnosis. It's very difficult sometimes to satisfy patients' questions. Patients want to know what is wrong with me, what is causing the symptoms that I came to the doctor for. They want to know what is the treatment, what can I do to get better. They want to know why did it happen to me, and they want to know why did it happen to me now. And in a surprising number of cases, the answer to all of those questions is I don't know. But patients tend to be very dissatisfied with an I don't know response, so that it takes a brave doctor to tell a patient, I don't know what your diagnosis is. I don't know how to treat your problem. I don't know why it's happened to you, and I don't know why it's happened to you now. However, if you do encounter a doctor who has the guts to tell you that he or she doesn't know, in my opinion, you've found a good doctor. Patients may insist on a diagnosis when no disease is apparent, or they may insist on a physical diagnosis when the doctor believes that the problem is psychological. We see this a lot in functional patients. And so doctors sometimes invent diagnoses for functional patients, and these invented diagnoses go in and out of fashion. Some older pretend diagnoses for people with functional ailments are neurasthenia, pelvic congestion, and one that I occasionally still see a person who claims to have the condition but has pretty much gone out of fashion, chronic fatigue syndrome. You can look up all of these on Wikipedia. Often, tests are used to prove the person has the diagnosis, but they're lousy, almost useless tests. Here's an example. When chronic fatigue syndrome was in vogue and thousands of people were diagnosed with it, doctors used a test called Epstein-Barr virus antibody, a blood test showing that the person had been infected with a virus called the Epstein-Barr virus. And they said that it was chronic Epstein-Barr virus infection that caused chronic fatigue syndrome. The problem is the majority of the population who are normal and have no medical problems have this antibody in their blood. And it's because most people get an infection with Epstein-Barr virus when they're young children, before about age 3 or 4. It's thought to be a simple cold, and they retain this positive blood test for the rest of their life. Another lousy test that is often used to make a diagnosis is rheumatoid factor. A lot of people have aches and pains here and there in their body that the doctor takes a history and examines them and cannot explain. Now, I'm not saying that these people don't have aches and pains. I'm simply saying that with the state of medical science today, the explanation isn't obvious. So doctors do some tests, and one of the tests they often do is a rheumatoid factor, which is a blood test that's supposed to indicate the presence of rheumatoid arthritis, a very serious inflammatory joint condition that causes destruction of joints. Again, the problem is that many normal people without the disease have a positive rheumatoid factor, and the incidence of positivity in normal people goes up with age, so that by age 60, close to half of normal people will have a positive rheumatoid factor despite not having rheumatoid arthritis. To make the test even worse, a significant minority of people who really do have rheumatoid arthritis do not have a positive rheumatoid factor. I almost think that the test should be banned. It's such a lousy test. However, people with mysterious pains are often very gratified and very pleased with their doctor if the doctor does a rheumatoid factor test and shows, here, this test for rheumatoid arthritis has come back positive. I've diagnosed you with rheumatoid arthritis. Instead of telling them that you have mysterious pains here and there that medicine cannot explain. So, what are conditions that I see overdiagnosed in disability patients? And here I mean not just the occasional one or two, but conditions that I see regularly in people applying for disability where the person believes that they have the condition because they've been told by doctors that they do, but it's obvious when I examine them that they do not have the condition. And before I start with the list, I want to point out that I have seen people with all of these conditions who definitely have them. It's just that I've seen many people diagnosed with these conditions who obviously don't have them. The first is rheumatoid arthritis, which I've already mentioned. Rheumatoid arthritis is an inflammatory arthritis, which means there must be at least one of these three features: joint swelling, joint warmth, or redness of the skin over joints, not just joint pain. If there's only joint pain, the person does not have rheumatoid arthritis, regardless of what their blood tests say. The second is sciatica, which sounds a lot worse than simple low back pain, which is pleasing to a lot of people and why a lot of doctors make the diagnosis despite the person not actually having features of sciatica, which I've discussed in another video. The next are two autoimmune diseases, Sjogren's syndrome and lupus, which have definite criteria which must be met for diagnosis, and again are often made incorrectly in people with mysterious aches and pains. Next, a new fad is Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. This is a condition that people are born with where their joints are hyperextensible, what we would call double jointed. And this does cause pain in multiple joints, and often joints will dislocate, pop out of joint with very little force. For example, some people with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome can take their fingers and bend them all the way back so they touch their forearm. Now, the thing is, everyone knows that a 7-year-old girl is much more flexible than a 70-year-old man. We think it's nice if a 7-year-old girl can do the splits, but we're not astonished. But we are astonished if a 70-year-old man can do the splits. So young women have much more extensible joints than older men or even older women. And it's now become a fad to diagnose women with just a little joint excess motion with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome when they simply don't have the condition. Another fad diagnosis right now is POTS, or postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. This is clearly defined by a change in pulse when the person stands up from a lying down position. Everyone's pulse increases a little when they go from a lying down to standing position. So far, I have had one person who actually met the criteria and a bunch who didn't but had been diagnosed with POTS. Another common overdiagnosis is fibromyalgia. There are certain specific criteria that must be met for the diagnosis, and I have a video on fibromyalgia. The majority of people I've examined with fibromyalgia have mysterious aches and pains but don't meet the criteria for fibromyalgia. I have definitely examined people who do meet the criteria for fibromyalgia. Another one is migraine headache. A lot of people aren't satisfied with the diagnosis of a normal tension headache. They want something more dramatic, especially if they're looking for time off work or disability. And they're more pleased to be diagnosed with migraine. Again, there are certain strict criteria to diagnose migraine. You can find them on Wikipedia, and the majority of people I see diagnosed with migraine don't have them. And finally, irritable bowel syndrome. Now, there are certain conditions that are also overdiagnosed in psychiatry, and I'll get to those in a moment. Most people are not aware that psychiatrists prescribed amphetamines like speed or meth to millions of Americans in the 1960s. And then that was realized to be a huge mistake, and the amount of prescriptions plummeted. And we're back in the fashion of prescribing amphetamines for almost everyone, with the misdiagnosis or overdiagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Now, this condition does exist, and I've seen examples of it, but I'd say that it's a fad right now, an excuse to put normal people on amphetamines, and in my opinion, currently about 99% of people diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADD, don't have the condition. The next overdiagnosed condition in psychiatry is post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, it certainly does exist, but there's this current delusion that everyone who's ever been through a difficult situation must be mentally ill as a result of it, and that's simply nonsense. In fact, most people who go through a traumatic experience eventually emerge stronger. They experience post-traumatic growth syndrome. The next two overdiagnoses go together, which are generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder. And they're overdiagnosed because of our current delusion that if everyone isn't deliriously happy 24/7, 365 days out of the year, they're mentally ill. And the fact is that worry and sadness are normal components of normal life, and the majority of people I see who claim to have anxiety and depression are normal. I've already mentioned that bipolar illness, it's currently a fad, and it's important to understand that to make the correct diagnosis of bipolar illness or manic depression, there must be episodes of mania, normalcy, and depression. And these episodes typically last several weeks each. Bipolar illness is not moodiness or disagreeableness. It's not a person who easily loses their temper, and it's not a person whose moods shift from hour to hour. Finally, a vastly overdiagnosed condition these days is gender dysphoria. And before anyone in the comments screams at me about being transphobic, I took care of my first two sex change patients in 1981, probably before you were born, and I've been doing so ever since. It's currently a fad to diagnose gender dysphoria. The fact is, a certain amount of gender confusion or ambiguity is normal for a lot of people during the teens and sometimes the early 20s, and does not indicate that all of those people are suffering from gender dysphoria, although a small percentage will turn out to actually have that diagnosis. Now, what are conditions that are underdiagnosed? Well, the first one that I see in disability patients is mild carpal tunnel syndrome, and I can't count the number of people I've seen who've told me that their hands go numb, especially when they wake up at night, and they've been told all sorts of explanations. Let me tell you something. If you're middle-aged, in your 40s, 50s, or 60s, especially if you're female, but it also happens in males, and you wake up at night with your hands numb, and it goes away after a while, you have carpal tunnel syndrome. Go see your doctor, ask what you can do about it. Next underdiagnosed condition I see is rotator cuff syndrome, or injury. I've seen a lot of people who can't raise their arm much higher than that, and they often haven't mentioned that to Social Security or to me when I take their history. If you haven't broken your arm or had a serious injury, but you can't raise your arm any higher than that, you probably have a rotator cuff problem, and see your doctor, because there's often things that can be done to help that. The next underdiagnosed condition is osteoarthritis, especially in the hands, and this is often misdiagnosed as rheumatoid arthritis. Remember, for rheumatoid arthritis, there must be joint swelling, often with redness of the skin and warmth. In osteoarthritis, there's joint pain and a little bit of bony swelling, but no redness and warmth. And osteoarthritis is far more common than rheumatoid arthritis. Two skin disorders that are underdiagnosed. One is called neurodermatitis, or picking disorder. These are people who pick at themselves as a nervous habit, and the hallmark is that they will have scabs and scratches and scars, but these will only be present in the areas that they can reach with their hands. For example, I can reach my upper back, but I can't reach my mid-back. So if I had neurodermatitis, you'd find scratches and scars here, but not in my mid-back. And these are very interesting people, because if you tell them that their condition is due to a psychological problem, they will swear on a 20-foot stack of Bibles that it is not, and that the doctor is mistaken. And I'm not sure why they're so adamant about that. Another underdiagnosed condition is self-mutilation, either superficial cutting of the wrist or burning with cigarettes, usually on the forearms. A final underdiagnosed condition is essential tremor, and I'm going to make a video about that because I've seen so many people with tremor who are terrified that they have Parkinson's disease, a very serious degenerative condition of the brain, and are very relieved when I tell them that they have essential tremor, which is a nuisance condition, but not really bad like Parkinson's disease. Now, in psychiatry, all the personality disorders are underdiagnosed, and especially psychopathic personality disorder. In fact, psychiatrists today pretend that psychopathic personality disorder doesn't exist. And the reason they claim that they don't diagnose it is because they don't feel that it's right to be judgmental. And let me point out right here, people with psychopathic personality disorder are bad people, and often evil people, and sometimes extremely evil people. Now, is it wrong to be judgmental? Well, first of all, deciding that it's best to be non-judgmental is a judgment. Deciding that people who are judgmental are wrong-headed is also a judgment. Second of all, I think that it reflects a certain weakness, pusillanimity of character, to refuse to judge people at all. After all, if you're completely non-judgmental, that means you believe there's no difference between Mother Teresa and Ted Bundy, that they're equally valuable and equally good. And to that I say, really? You really think there's no difference between Mother Teresa and Ted Bundy? I don't believe that. Other psychological conditions that are frequently underdiagnosed are alcoholism, drug addiction, all functional illnesses, and normality. As I've stated in many videos, many people who are diagnosed with mental illness, such as anxiety disorder or depression, are simply psychologically normal and are not mentally ill. Well, I hope that you found this helpful. Please comment if you disagree or agree or have more to add. And as always, remember, if it happens, it's possible.